see you. A huge welcome to Real Conversations. My name is Jack and I'll be your host for this lunchtime. And I want to say right from the start that our hope for this week is that it might be a space in which we can be honest and real with each other, real about our questions, real about our objections to these big questions of life. We'd love you to join us in that. Each lunchtime this week, we'll be exploring a different one of these questions. And to help us do that, we have Niv Lobo here as our guest speaker. Niv studied English literature at Clare College here in Cambridge, and now spends much of his time speaking at events like these around the country, helping to kickstart conversations on these big questions. We're delighted to have Niv here with us today, addressing the topic of the evidence for the resurrection. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Niv will give a short talk, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So please do be texting in your questions during the talk to the number that appears on the pillars and hopefully on the screen behind me. We'd love to hear your questions. Absolutely no question is off limits. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Niv to the front.
Good afternoon, it's wonderful to be here again, and can I thank you for coming along, if you have been coming along. It's just been thrilling to hear your thoughts and opinions and reflections on what we've been saying, so thank you for that. Our title this lunchtime is, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? We're talking about the claim that Jesus, having been brutally killed by trained professionals, rose again bodily from the dead 3 days later. And if that didn't happen, then everything we've been saying from the front at Real is wrong, and you should pity us. But if it did happen, then that means that Jesus is the one he says he is, that the life-giving relationship with a loving God he says he can make real is possible, and you can have it. Big words for a Wednesday lunchtime, aren't they? But that is our topic, real evidence. I remember this being one of the most refreshing things I encountered about the Christian faith. It doesn't just invoke mystery every time evidence is sought. And right from the beginning, it put forward a falsifiable claim to those who wanted to know the truth. And my aim this lunchtime is to introduce us to some of the evidence behind this claim. I want us to do that by thinking through two questions. Question one, how do we explain the event itself? Question two, how do we explain the explanation that early Christians gave and stood by? So firstly, how do we explain the event itself? Whatever happened in the days after Jesus' death, it requires an explanation. When we assess these days in history, we are dealing with something remarkable, whatever we think happened. Because people die all the time. People die violently all the time. Death by crucifixion was not at all uncommon. We even know of other claimants for the role of Jewish Messiah who were executed. All these things happened, and the world carried on substantially unchanged. Yet the days following the execution of Jesus of Nazareth were utterly different. Those days have had a deep, sweeping impact on a global scale, setting in motion massive historical change. And as we investigate these days, we have the luxury of extraordinarily early testimony from only a few years later to work with. Here's the source. It's a Christian leader named Paul writing a letter to the Christian community in Corinth. I'll just read it. He writes, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Aramaic for Peter, and then to 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born." Now this little passage is of tremendous value to the historian. The letter it's from, people date to about 55 AD, but as you can see, Paul isn't writing something original. He talks about passing on something he already received, a very, very early Christian tradition. Many scholars have concluded that what we have here is a creedal formula, a dramatic early insight into Christian belief and practice. And many historians working on when it is Paul could have received this plausibly date it to about 38 AD. So looking at this early source and the Gospel accounts, here's some of the key historical data we're able to isolate. First, Jesus was crucified, died, and then buried. Second, 3 days later, friends and early associates of Jesus claimed to have found his tomb empty. Third, in the immediate aftermath, on separate occasions and in different ways, many different witnesses claimed to have met with Jesus. Fourth, these witnesses, despite their prior fear and guiltiness, were totally changed and became almost immediately proclaimers of the risen Jesus, willing to sacrifice even their lives for the cause. These facts, which is all they are, stand out in history. How do we explain these events? That's my question. Now, at this point, I was surprised to find that these key facts are widely accepted by all kinds of scholars. There is some debate from a tiny fringe minority over whether the tomb is really empty, but all kinds of historians and New Testament scholars, believers and skeptics, accept these facts as givens. Why do they do that? Why treat the New Testament as historical evidence? Well, it's because they're being fair historians. We have no good reason at all to dismiss the New Testament as historical evidence, and plenty of good reasons to take it seriously. So for one thing, we might look at the people who are put forward as witnesses. What you find in all four Gospel accounts is that the first people to discover Jesus' empty tomb were women. Now, having women as your first witnesses was a stunning choice in the first century. I'm sorry to say that it was a time of unchecked, unquestioned sexism. Women weren't even considered reliable as witnesses in court. So putting them forward as witnesses is a very telling thing. It falls into the category of things you just wouldn't make up unless it had actually happened. Because saying that made your case less plausible. More than that, the witnesses aren't that impressive. What you find is that the next generation of Christian writing often reads as hagiography. That is, it's unrealistic, highly favourable portrayals of Christians, lionising their bravery, accentuating their piety, skating over anything negative about them. That makes all kinds of sense, because it's good propaganda. That is what you would write if you were out to convince people. But that's not what we find in the New Testament. Thomas, close to Jesus, doubts. Peter denies Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, is recorded as a skeptic in Jesus' life, and yet crops up here as someone to whom Jesus appeared. Most stunningly of all, Paul. Let me give you some background about him. He went from being a rabid anti-Christian to then being the most accomplished and articulate early Christian thinker. What historians have found is that these texts don't really read like propaganda. Not much about them seems written to persuade many people, but more like the honest recounting of people who want to say what happened, even if they didn't fully understand it at the time. So we can't reject these writings as history. What we have to do is assess the facts and try and find a coherent explanation, one that accounts for all of them. So how do you explain these four facts of history? From the very beginning, the Christians had an explanation that made perfect sense, and continues to do so. Jesus, just as he said he would, had risen bodily from the dead. So of course the tomb was empty, of course he met his disciples, of course they were changed, utterly changed, by the experience. Jesus rising from the dead accounts for all of that evidence. But when I was first looking into these things, that was not the explanation I was looking for, so I went looking for others. And there are some other explanations out there. Some have advocated a swoon theory, that Jesus didn't really die, and that's why his tomb was empty, that's why he appeared to others. Maybe convincing at first, but really problematic the more we look at it. For one thing, the Romans were really good at killing people. Excellent at it, did it all the time. And more than that, John's Gospel tells us that Jesus' side was pierced and what looked like blood and water flowed out. Talk to a medic and they'll tell you that's a pretty clear sign that he was dead. More than that, here's a skeptic from the 19th century called Daniel Strauss, and he wrote this. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry. An idea of Jesus barely surviving a horrific execution doesn't add up with what happened next. So we can drop that theory. Another one out there is that perhaps a stolen body explains the presence of the empty tomb. And again, the problems with this are vast. Who stole it? The disciples? Well, for one thing, we then have to explain how they managed to Metal Gear Solid their way past the guards stationed at the front. And then we need to explain how 500 of them at one time claim to have met Jesus for themselves. Where did the appearances come from? More to the point, what this means is that the early witnesses were not just prepared to die for what they thought was true, but rather that they were prepared to die for what they knew was certainly false. Does that add up to you? Well, maybe it wasn't the disciples. Maybe the authorities stole the body, and frankly, that one is ridiculous. Because if they had, all they had to do to squash early Christian belief was produce evidence, any evidence of Jesus' body. The early Christian movement survived and even snowballed because the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, so blatantly and easily falsified, never was. Here's how the French polymath Blaise Pascal, you may know his triangle, put it. Follow it out to the end and imagine these men meeting after Jesus' death and conspiring to say that he had risen from the dead. This means attacking all the powers that be. The human heart is singularly susceptible to fickleness, to change, to promises, to bribery. One of them only had to deny the story under these inducements, or still more because of possible imprisonment, tortures, and death. And they would all have been lost. Follow that out. Well, others advance a theory of hallucination. Perhaps in their grief, the disciples were especially susceptible to see what they wanted to see. And again, the problems with this are vast. For one thing, we know that they knew grief would cloud their objectivity. It's why Thomas, the famous doubting Thomas, took so much convincing before he believed his friends. They really did know that dead people stay dead. Moreover, some kind of hallucination hypothesis works against medical findings, which tell us that by and large hallucinations happen to individuals and are not group events. And more to the point, we would still be left with Jesus' body in the tomb. So how do we explain the event itself? Every part of the evidence must be accounted for. And there is an explanation that fits all the pieces, that puts the facts together perfectly. To believe this is an act of faith, but not blind faith. It's faith working with the most reasonable explanation of the facts. And rejecting the resurrection takes, to my mind, a great deal of blind faith. And that is actually thrown into sharper relief when we come to my second question. Not only does the event need explaining, but the explanation needs explaining. You see, the concept of resurrection, as the Christians proclaimed it, was utterly foreign to Second Temple Judaism from which it emerged. Second Temple Judaism didn't see resurrection as anything other than an end-of-time event. They weren't expecting one-offs. It was equally strange to Greek and Roman thought, in which physical material reality played nothing like as important a role. So we need to explain where this concept of resurrection comes from. What emerges in the earliest decades of Christianity is a cogent, consistent, and thought-through doctrine of bodily resurrection, with some remarkable facets. There's nothing like it in the worldviews around it. Now, when we study the history of ideas, we normally see gradual development, new ideas emerging and then picking up steam. The speed is usually glacial, but that is not what we find here. We find an almost fully formed portrayal of a risen Jesus, with well-worked-out implications of that resurrection. See, other Christian doctrines were refined over time. They took centuries to articulate. And here we have a raft of new and compelling teachings appearing in a very short period of time. Just one brief example. Early Christians immediately saw the connection between Jesus rising from the dead and his status as Messiah. You can see that in Peter's speech just weeks after the crucifixion recorded by Luke, or Paul's letter to the Romans. But with other Messiah claimants who were put to death, that thought never even occurred to them. No creative exploration and reassessment of the Hebrew Bible was required there. Right from the beginning, we find these unique teachings coming out of an embattled community of faith. It's close to incredible to believe that they manufactured it out of nothing, especially when we think of the kinds of people who put their names to these ideas. Just think, what would you have to do to convince your best friend, if you have one, or your sibling, if you have one, and your worst enemy, if you have one, that you are the Son of God risen from the dead, all three of them, at once? But that is exactly what Jesus did. We find Peter and James and Paul coming forward and putting their names on this idea. It beggars belief to think that these things were fabricated out of thin air, made up behind closed doors. The early Christians didn't have the time or the influence or the conceptual categories to come up with this. And that's just coming up with it. What made people believe it? What made them so deeply loyal to these new practices and ideas so even when it meant their death? Or whatever explanation we come up with for the event, it cannot be isolated from the sweeping cultural upheaval this idea brought about. And when we think about the way the cards were stacked against the early Christians, and yet none of the authorities were able to quash this movement, you have to ask why. I've still not heard an argument that does justice to the details and the big picture, apart from Jesus' bodily resurrection in history. So how do we explain the event itself? How do we explain the explanation of it? Those are my two questions. And we have only scratched the surface. Tomorrow night we're going much deeper, so please come back and test this claim. But can I say, I can remember when I first started digging into this, not wanting it to be true. Investigating this was probably the first time I had to admit that I was less objective than I'd like to think. I want to ask very gently, could that be true for some of us today? I said, show me evidence, but however good it was, I could always move the goalposts. I could always say, but it happened so long ago, fully aware that that is terrible logic, the kind I'd never tolerate with the rest of history. Time doesn't alter facts. I could always say, but miracles just don't happen, so he can't have risen from the dead. Again, fully aware that I was using circular reasoning, begging the question, concluding at the outset what my investigation was supposed to open up. And it's my hope that all of us can engage with this claim honestly. See, there's a reason why this claim had such an impact on the world. Not only is it true, but it changes everything. It means that hope is not just wishful thinking. It means that death doesn't get the last word. Robert Webb, the comedian, reflected poignantly on the death of his brother before he was born in his autobiography. And he writes, "One way of imagining life is that it's a competition between love and death. Death always wins, of course, but love is there to make its victory a hollow one. That's what love is for." It's beautiful writing. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then the truth is even more beautiful. Death didn't always win. And so love doesn't just hollow out death's victory, love hollows out death itself. If Jesus rose from the dead, then we have reason to hope. And the Bible's promise is of a God who will fix our broken world and wipe away his people's tears and do it with nail-scarred hands. Just as he left the tomb empty, if Jesus rose from the dead, he can empty death of all its power over us. And that doesn't just change our future. It actually means something for all of us right now. If Jesus rose from the dead, then it would be very wrong to talk about who Jesus was. No, we're talking about who Jesus is. Alive, and so someone whom we can know today. Standing before us with an offer of love and of life. So please can I ask, what will you do with him? What will you do with his offer? He loves you with a love stronger than death. What will you do with him? Now I'm aware for some of us this is the first time digging into all of this, and we have lots more opportunities to keep digging. So please come back Seymour, that I would be cheating you if I didn't tell you that this lunchtime, today, you could have what Jesus is offering. That your life doesn't have to continue or end in hopelessness or despair. Because the evidence points very substantially to Jesus risen bodily from the dead. And his offer of life and love and hope is for you today. What's stopping you from having it? Oh, I don't have one of them on me, but all of you have a response form. If that's something you'd like to explore for yourself, do grab your response form and count me in. And then come chat to me. I'd love to talk to you about this. I think there'd be no better decision you can make. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me. Jack's going to come up in a bit, and then we've got time for questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Niv. Do keep texting in your questions to the number around the pillars. We'll be back up here in just a moment to answer those. Why not take this moment now to fill in those response forms? If you're interested to find out more, tell me more, and someone from the Christian Union will get in touch with you. Or maybe there might be some of you for whom what Niv's just said is true of you, and actually you want to tick count me in. If you do, then come and chat to him afterwards. That would be a great thing to do. So a minute now just to keep texting questions and to fill in those response forms, and then we'll be back up in a minute. We're going to get started with some questions now. Thank you so much for everyone who's texted in. There's lots of questions, so we'll get started straight away. Paul mentions no women in his writing. All other Gospels were written decades after the resurrection and not by eyewitnesses. Paul was the only eyewitness and could have easily falsified his claim for whatever reason. What do you make of the claim that there were no women in Paul's writing?
Fantastic. Thank you for that question. Just before we begin, I really contest the claim that the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. We are grateful that a Cambridge academic, a man called Richard Borkham, has written a landmark study on whether the Gospels were eyewitness material called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's brilliant and it's substantial. So if you text in that question, please search it out, because I think it makes a really strong case that they were eyewitness testimonies. Secondly, what Paul says, he admits he didn't come up with. He actually passes on as something received. If you read the Corinthian epistles, that's a really striking admission. Rhetorically, you might expect Paul to say, here's what I've got to say. But at this point, he defers to a prior tradition that is found among the apostles. And so we have very little reason to doubt that this is genuinely what early Christians were saying. Finally, and someone who's lurked around my thinking in this question is a scholar called N.T. Wright. He is brilliant, and his study, Jesus and the Resurrection of the Son of God, is what it's called, might be one of the most important texts to read on this question. And you're at Cambridge, so you've no excuse. Go find it, it's in the UL, and read it. But one of the points he makes is that this is actually part of the picture. That what was passing around as an early creedal formula is probably something that hides the role of the earliest women because it might be a countercultural thing. You've kind of got an official thing that Paul is sharing that had taken form creedally, which then makes the gospel writer's insistence that women were there at the tomb, the first of the tomb, a really striking one. And we still have to answer why on earth they're there in the narrative. One of my favourite novelists is a woman called Marilyn Robinson. She points out that in John's gospel, the first word the risen Jesus is recorded as saying is woman. And she says, it's a beautiful line, she says, I know of no other moment in which that word is a title of honour. It's extraordinary. Worthy of investigation. Thank you.
A brief question about the validity of Paul's letter. Could that have been a lie or been falsified?
Thank you again. Lots of Paul's letters are contested in their authorship, but some of them are not, and the Corinthian epistle is among the ones that are not. I would say that none of them have been sort of forged later, and none of them are pseudonymous, that is to say, someone else's name put on it. But the most stringent secular critic would say that this is one of Paul's authentic letters.
Is there any evidence of Jesus' resurrection recorded from non-Christians or evidence outside of the Bible?
It's a great question. It kind of begs the question. Unlike the Quran, the Bible is actually a collection of writings, and so what you've got is not just one writing, monolithic in its statement, but many different writings from different perspectives. We're looking at someone like Paul, who comes forward, looking at someone like Peter, who comes forward, etc., etc. So already within the Bible, you've got a kind of multitude of voices, a polyphony. In answer to that question, we actually do have a reference from Josephus that Jesus was raised from the dead. Some would say this was a later Christian interpolation. The problem with that is that we actually don't have any earlier copies of Josephus to rule that out, and it's very probable that Josephus was writing sort of sarcastically at that point. Moreover, someone like Tacitus temptingly says that Jesus was put to death, and yet the superstition flared up again afterwards. That, I think, is a really good clue that people were wrestling with what on earth generated this energy of Christian proclamation straight after their founder was humiliatingly killed. Yeah, thank you.
I'd love to open it up to the floor if anyone wants to raise a hand and ask any questions in response to what Niv's just said. There's a mic that will go around here. That one in the middle.
I've got a question about coherence of the Christian story of the bodily resurrection. Because isn't there some debate within the Bible as to how bodily the resurrection really was? Because I know there is doubting Thomas puts his finger in the wounds, which suggests it's very physical as resurrection. But then there are also stories in the Bible, like on the road to Emmaus, or Jesus going through a locked door.
Mm-hmm.
So is that just a question of how you would explain the difference in these narratives?
Thank you. That's a brilliant question and a thoughtful one. The first thing to say is that actually the New Testament is unanimous every time it describes the resurrection in calling it bodily. I suspect Michael might talk about this tomorrow night, but in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he even makes that point. This is a bodily thing. The question then is what kind of physicality Jesus has in order that he can eat fish on one occasion. His disciples think, is this a ghost? And Jesus goes, no, they eat something, they give us some fish. Ghosts don't eat fish, they can't eat. It's, for them, it's what they needed to see. But then, as you're absolutely right, he seems to walk through walls. How's that possible? A really brilliant point that N.T. Wright made in his book, and I definitely commend it to you, because if you're asking that kind of question, he's dealing with them brilliantly, is that Jesus is more solid than the walls around him. Like a plane flying towards a bank of clouds, and both of them look solid, and you wonder what's going to happen, but the plane goes right through, because it turns out to be more solid than the clouds ever were. The claim of Christianity, and again Michael will touch on this, is that physicality itself is redeemed. And so what Jesus rises again in is not a kind of ghostly spirit body, but a real physical one. And we with real physical bodies have every reason to hope that our existence in the hereafter will be physical and drastically better than it is now. Great if you look at your body and like me think, oh Lord.
Thank you. Anyone else from the floor like to stick up a hand? We'll move on with another question from texted in. Could they have got confused, the disciples, and gone to the wrong tomb?
Yeah, a good question. I've often gone to the wrong place. This morning I walked right past this venue, wasn't looking. The problems with this are vast. A, there'd still be the tomb. B, everyone would just say, pipe down, we know where his tomb is, you just went to the wrong one. And thirdly, we have accounts in the Gospels of people going and checking. So the women go, see, come back, and then others go, see, and look as well. And you'd imagine that they'd figure out which one the tomb was. Yeah.
A question that says, many people have died for things that aren't true. Gives an example of David Koresh, who believed he was the Messiah in the Second Coming, and has persuaded others to kill themselves. What makes the story about Jesus different?
Brilliant. Now here's the thing, you're absolutely right. Many people have died for things that weren't true, but all of them believed that it was. That's the point. And what you've got with the idea that the disciples were dying for a lie, something they fabricated, is the belief that they died for what they knew for certain was false. As Pascal put it, follow it out. Does that stand up to you? And this isn't just one person with one claim. This is a crowd of Christian voices clamouring around this claim and not backing down from it. Backing down would be the easiest thing to do. Yeah, thank you.
Jesus rising from the dead results in such a good offer. Isn't this a great motive to fabricate it, even if we don't know the precise means by which it was done?
Thank you. And I want to say that the reason why it sounds like such a good offer is that your world has been shaped for 2,000 years or so by this offer. At the time, nothing about it was particularly attractive because it made so little sense. It wasn't the kind of thing that you got brownie points for making up. And if we want to say that perhaps a couple of them had fantastic imaginations and were able to basically do sci-fi before sci-fi, that still doesn't explain why so many of them anchored this to real things they said they saw and heard and touched in Jesus who appeared to them. So again, we need to reckon with the fact that at the time, this idea was wild. It made no sense. It was unexpectedly successful. It sounds successful to us, we think, well, life after death, brilliant, sounds excellent. But everyone at the time already believed in life after death, in some form or another. This was a kind of life out of death that was offensive because of the terms on which it was offered. Yeah.
Brilliant. This may have to be a final question. What if I'm happy with life now? Can't I just accept it as a historical fact and carry on living as I am?
And I want to begin by saying I'm glad you're happy about life now. That's a good thing. Not everyone I know can say it, and even those who do don't always say it for long. But I would want to say that if it's true, then we want to follow out that idea and its implications. And if Jesus really has risen from the dead, then that may not feel like a lot to you today. I hope it does. But it will mean an awful lot to you when you face death. And for those of us who've known death in our lives, through loved ones we've lost, you will know this is not an abstract conceptual discussion. This is the stuff of life. In the midst of life, we are in death, as one of our nation's texts has put it. What do we do about that? Yeah, so it will matter an awful lot. And every one of us will die. And like we were hearing last night, God will not fly off the handle at us at an irrational rage. He will be fair to us. He will be just to us on the basis of what we've heard, on the basis of what we've done. And if we believe it's a historical fact that Jesus rose from the dead, opening up his arms and offering us himself, then what will happen if we say no, and say no persistently? I want to say that gently, because I know it's a huge thing to say, but I can't not say it. Thank you for that question.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Niv. Let's give Niv a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but this really is just the start of the conversation. We've got this space all afternoon, so do stick around and keep chatting. Tea and cake will be brought to you in your seats. Niv will be here at the front. He'd love to meet you and answer your questions and chat more. And at 2 p.m, back in here, there'll be an informal discussion starting, weighing up the evidence further for the resurrection. A number of lawyers have written books on the evidence for the resurrection, and even some who wouldn't have called themselves Christians at first have looked into the evidence and become convinced. Chris Townsend, stand up and give a wave. Chris will be leading this discussion at 2 p.m. He himself is a professional lawyer and will be sharing his response and opening up that discussion. I'd love to mention a selection of books that we've got here on this table as well. These are free for you to take away. And two particularly to flag up. One slightly meatier one, it's called The Case for Christ. This was written by a legal journalist who set out to disprove the claims of the Christian faith, and actually he himself became convinced in the process. And then secondly, this small booklet, a little bit lighter read, Resurrection, Fact or Fiction. Why not come over and grab one of those on your way out? They're free for you to take away. There's loads going on this week. Hopefully you've got a flyer and you can check out what is going on. Tonight we'll be joined by Slavko Hazic, ex-Mafia boss who became a Christian, sharing his life story. Just a word about those response forms as well. Please do keep filling them out if you haven't already, and pop them in the box on your way out. Thank you so much again for joining us today. Do stick around and keep chatting, and we'd love to see you again this evening or later in the week.